The steel door slammed behind Mason Willis with a sound that echoed through his entire body like a death sentence. He stood frozen in the intake corridor of Blackwater Correctional Facility, his orange jumpsuit still stiff and unfamiliar against his skin, the fabric scratching his neck with every shallow breath he took. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced across the concrete walls like predators circling their prey. 23 years old, and this was now his reality for the next 8 years. Armed robbery, a stupid decision made in 30 seconds that would cost him nearly a decade of his life. Mason's hands trembled as a correctional officer, a barrel-chested man with a scar running down his left cheek, shoved a thin mattress, a scratchy blanket, and a transparent bag containing basic toiletries into his arms. Block C, cell 47. "Keep your head down, your mouth shut, and maybe you'll make it through your first week," the officer said, his voice devoid of any emotion, as if he'd delivered this same speech 1,000 times before to 1,000 other terrified young men who thought they were tough until they walked through those gates. Mason nodded, unable to form words. His throat felt like sandpaper. The corridor stretched ahead of him, a long tunnel of cinder blocks and peeling paint that smelled of industrial cleaner, sweat, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Desperation, perhaps, or accumulated fear that had seeped into the walls over decades. As he walked, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, he became aware of eyes watching him. Through the narrow windows of cell doors, faces appeared, some curious, some predatory, some completely dead inside. He heard whispers, low laughs, the scrape of something metal against metal. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. "Fresh meat," someone called out from behind a door, followed by a chorus of laughter that made Mason's blood run cold. He climbed the metal stairs to the second tier, each step clanging beneath his weight, announcing his arrival to everyone in the block. When he reached cell 47, he found the door already open. Inside, a man sat on the lower bunk, a mountain of muscle covered in faded tattoos that told stories Mason didn't want to know. The man looked up, his eyes cold and calculating, scanning Mason from head to toe like a predator sizing up potential prey. "You're in the top bunk," the man said, his voice like gravel in a blender. "Don't touch my stuff. Don't talk to me unless I talk to you first. Don't even breathe too loud when I'm trying to sleep. We clear?" "Yeah," Mason managed, his voice coming out higher than he intended. "We're clear." He climbed onto the top bunk, the metal frame groaning under his weight, and lay there staring at the ceiling, which was covered in water stains that formed patterns like Rorschach tests. He tried to count the cracks in the concrete, anything to keep his mind occupied, but his thoughts kept spiraling back to how he'd ended up here, to the convenience store, to the gun that felt so heavy in his shaking hands, to the terrified look on the clerk's face. The hours crawled by. At 6 p.m., a buzzer sounded throughout the facility, and his cellmate stood up without a word and left. Mason hesitated, then followed, joining the stream of inmates heading toward the cafeteria. The dining hall was massive, filled with long metal tables bolted to the floor and benches that had seen better days. The noise was overwhelming, hundreds of conversations happening simultaneously, the clatter of trays, the scrape of chairs, guards barking orders. Mason grabbed a tray and moved through the line, where inmates in hairnets plopped unidentifiable food onto his compartmentalized tray. Mashed potatoes that looked like paste, something that might have been meatloaf, green beans that had lost all color, a small carton of milk, and a piece of white bread. Finding a seat was like navigating a minefield. Every table seemed to belong to someone, to some group. He spotted an empty space at the end of a table near the wall and headed toward it, keeping his eyes down. But as he set his tray down, a hand slammed onto the table, making everything rattle. "You lost new fish?" The voice belonged to a man with a shaved head and a tear tattoo under his left eye. Behind him stood 3 others, all wearing the same expression of barely contained violence. I was just looking for a place to sit," Mason stammered, already picking up his tray with shaking hands. "Well, you found the wrong place. This table belongs to the Northside Kings. You ain't no king, are you, fish?" "No, sir. I'm sorry. I'll just..." "Damn right, you'll just..." The man pushed Mason's shoulder, not hard enough to make him fall, but enough to establish dominance, to make it clear who held the power here. Mason moved away, his face burning with humiliation, feeling the eyes of the entire cafeteria on him. He finally found a spot at a table in the corner where 2 older men sat, both of whom ignored him completely. He sat down and tried to eat, but the food tasted like cardboard, and every bite felt like swallowing broken glass because his throat was so tight with anxiety. That's when he first saw Ray Bulldog Calder. The man entered the cafeteria, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they lowered. People shifted in their seats. Guards straightened their postures. Bulldog moved through the room like a shark through water, smooth, confident, dangerous. He was probably in his late 40s with gray touching his temples, his muscular frame still intimidating despite his age. A network of scars crisscrossed his forearms, and his eyes, Mason noticed, missed nothing. They swept the room constantly, cataloging, assessing, calculating. "That's Ray Calder," one of the older men at Mason's table whispered, following his gaze. "Runs this place. Been here 17 years. Got another 20 to go. You stay out of his way. You might survive. You cross him." The man drew a finger across his throat. Mason watched as Bulldog sat down at a table in the center of the cafeteria, where a group of men immediately gathered around him like courtiers around a king. Money changed hands, discreet and quick. Favors were asked and granted or denied with a nod or a shake of the head. This was the real power structure of Blackwater, Mason realized. Not the guards, not the warden. This man. After dinner, back in his cell, Mason lay on his bunk thinking about his situation. He had exactly $10 in his commissary account, money his mother had scraped together and deposited before he was transferred. $10 was nothing on the outside, but in here he was learning it might as well be a fortune. He'd heard inmates talking during the walk back from the cafeteria. Everything had a price. Protection, better food, information, safety. $10. One chance to maybe, possibly survive this nightmare. But as Mason stared at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to his cellmate's heavy breathing from the bunk below, another thought kept nagging at him. During dinner, before Bulldog had arrived, Mason had noticed an old man sitting alone at a table near the kitchen. The man was thin, almost skeletal, with white hair and hands that trembled as he tried to eat. No one sat near him. No one spoke to him. He was like a ghost, present but invisible, forgotten by everyone in this brutal ecosystem. Something about that image haunted Mason. Maybe it was because he saw his own future in that man, alone, vulnerable, forgotten. Or maybe it was something his mother had always told him, that even in the darkest places, you had to hold on to your humanity, had to remember that compassion was what separated people from animals. A crazy idea began to form in Mason's mind. An idea so stupid, so potentially suicidal, that he almost laughed at himself for even considering it. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the only choice that made sense, the only action that would let him sleep at night and look at himself in the scratched metal mirror above the tiny sink in his cell. By the time sleep finally came, Mason had made his decision. Tomorrow he would approach Ray Bulldog Calder. Tomorrow he would spend his $10. Tomorrow everything would change. He just had no idea how much. Mason barely slept that night. Every sound in the cell block seemed amplified in the darkness. The cough of an inmate 3 cells down, the rhythmic pacing of the guard during his rounds, the distant clang of metal that might have been a door or something far more sinister. His cellmate snored like a chainsaw, oblivious to Mason's racing thoughts and the decision that weighed on him like a concrete block pressing against his chest. When the morning buzzer finally sounded at 5:30 a.m., Mason felt like he'd been awake for days. His eyes burned, his muscles ached from lying tense for hours, and his mouth tasted like copper and fear. He climbed down from his bunk carefully, avoiding his cellmate who was already awake and doing push-ups in the narrow space between the bunks and the toilet, his breath coming in controlled bursts that suggested this was a daily ritual refined over years. The morning routine at Blackwater was a carefully choreographed dance of controlled chaos. Inmates lined up for head count, then shuffled to the showers where Mason learned quickly to keep his eyes down and move fast. The water was lukewarm at best, and the soap dispensers barely worked, but at least it was something. He dressed quickly in a fresh orange jumpsuit that was somehow even more uncomfortable than yesterday's, the fabric stiff with industrial starch. Breakfast was a grim affair. Powdered eggs that looked and tasted like yellow rubber, 2 pieces of toast that could double as roofing shingles, and coffee so weak it was barely distinguishable from the water that came out of the showers. Mason forced himself to eat, knowing he'd need the energy for what he was planning to do. His hands shook slightly as he held his plastic spork, and he had to concentrate to keep the eggs from sliding off his tray. The old man was there again, sitting at the same isolated table near the kitchen entrance. This morning, Mason could see him more clearly in the harsh fluorescent light. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older, with skin like parchment stretched over bone. His hands trembled constantly, some kind of palsy or neurological condition, making it difficult for him to eat. His eyes were a watery blue, distant and unfocused, as if he was looking at something far away that no one else could see. A few other inmates walked past him, some deliberately bumping his chair, others making comments Mason couldn't hear, but could imagine based on their sneering expressions. "That's Eddie Crawford," a voice said beside him. Mason turned to find a Latino man in his 30s sitting down, someone he hadn't noticed approach. The man had kind eyes despite the hard set of his jaw and the faded gang tattoos on his neck. "Been here 28 years. He was already old when I got here 15 years ago. People say he used to be somebody important on the outside, but now..." He shrugged. "Now he's just waiting to die. Nobody bothers with him anymore. He's got nothing, means nothing, is nothing. A ghost. Why doesn't anyone help him?" Mason asked before he could stop himself. The man looked at him with something between pity and amusement. "Help him? New fish. This ain't a charity. This is survival. You help someone, you're taking food out of your own mouth, putting a target on your own back. Eddie's got no family sending money, no connections, no protection. He's invisible because that's all he can afford to be." The man stood up, collected his tray, and walked away, leaving Mason alone with his thoughts and his increasingly insane plan. He watched Eddie struggle to bring a piece of toast to his mouth, watched it fall twice before the old man gave up and just sat there, staring at his tray with an expression of such profound defeat that Mason had to look away. After breakfast, inmates were assigned to various work details. Mason, being new, was sent to the laundry facility, a massive room filled with industrial washers and dryers that turned the air into a sauna of steam and the smell of detergent and sweat. The noise was deafening, the heat oppressive, and the work mindless. Sorting, loading, unloading, folding. Hours blurred together in the humid hell of the laundry room, but Mason's mind was elsewhere, rehearsing what he would say, how he would approach Ray Calder, running through 100 scenarios that all ended badly. Lunch came and went. Mason barely tasted the food. He was too busy watching, waiting, trying to figure out the right moment. Bulldog sat at his usual table, surrounded by his usual crew, 5 men who served as his enforcers, advisors, and eyes throughout the facility. Mason recognized the dynamics now. One man handled money, counting something discreetly under the table. Another seemed to be reporting information, leaning in close to whisper in Bulldog's ear. A third was clearly muscle, his knuckles scarred and swollen from recent violence. The afternoon work shift dragged on forever. By the time they returned to their cells for the 4 o'clock head count, Mason's nerves were so frayed he thought he might vomit. He had maybe 2 hours before dinner. 2 hours to either talk himself out of this or commit to it completely. He sat on his bunk, took out the small piece of paper where he'd written his commissary account number, and stared at it until the numbers blurred. His cellmate noticed. "You got that look," the big man said, speaking to Mason for the first time beyond his initial warnings. "That look like you're about to do something stupid. Word of advice from someone who's been down 8 years. Don't. Whatever you're thinking, it ain't worth it." "What if it is?" Mason heard himself say. "What if it's the only thing that is worth it?" The cellmate studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Then God help you, Fish. God help you." Dinner arrived with the 6 o'clock buzzer. Mason's heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his temples and his fingertips and every nerve ending in his body. He went through the food line mechanically, not even registering what was being plopped onto his tray. He scanned the cafeteria and spotted Bulldog already seated at his table, already conducting his nightly business like some medieval lord holding court. This was it. Now or never. Mason's legs felt like they were filled with concrete as he walked toward Bulldog's table. Conversations around him died away. He felt every eye in the cafeteria turn toward him, felt the weight of their attention like a physical force trying to push him back. Bulldog's enforcers noticed him first, their bodies tensing, hands moving to positions where Mason suspected they had shanks hidden. One of them, a massive black man with a scar that split his eyebrow, stood up and moved to intercept Mason. "You lost, new fish?" the man said, his voice like distant thunder. "I need to speak to Mr. Calder," Mason said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded despite the terror churning in his gut. "I have a business proposition." The enforcer laughed, a sound without humor. "A business proposition? You hear that, Bulldog? Fresh Fish wants to talk business." But Bulldog held up a hand, silencing the laughter rippling around his table. His eyes locked onto Mason's, and Mason felt like he was being x-rayed, examined down to his very soul. Those eyes had seen everything, done everything, survived everything. They were the eyes of a man who had learned to read people in seconds, to determine their value, their threat level, their breaking point. "Let him approach," Bulldog said finally, his voice surprisingly calm, almost gentle. But Mason knew better than to mistake gentleness for weakness. The enforcer stepped aside, and Mason walked the final few steps to Bulldog's table. Up close, he could see more details. The spiderweb tattoo on Bulldog's neck that marked him as having done serious time, the thin white scar that ran from his ear to his jaw, the way his hands rested on the table, relaxed but ready to move with deadly speed if necessary. "You got 30 seconds, Fish," Bulldog said. "Make them count." Mason swallowed hard, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of paper with his account number. "I have $10 in my commissary account. I want to give it to you." Bulldog's expression didn't change, but several of his men laughed outright. $10, one of them said. "This punk thinks he can buy protection with $10? That's not even enough for a pack of ramen." But Bulldog held up his hand again, silencing them. $10 is $10, he said, his eyes never leaving Mason's face. "But protection costs a lot more than that, especially for someone green as you. So either you're stupid or there's more to this." "Which is it?" "There's more," Mason said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact, even though every instinct screamed at him to look away, to run, to take back his words and disappear into the anonymous mass of inmates. "I don't want protection for myself." Now Bulldog's expression did change. One eyebrow raised slightly, the first sign of genuine surprise Mason had seen from him. "Come again?" "The $10. I want you to use it to help Eddie Crawford, the old man who sits alone. He needs—" Mason's voice caught, and he had to clear his throat. "He needs someone to look out for him, to make sure he gets food he can actually eat, to make sure nobody messes with him. He's got nobody, and I can't watch him suffer like that." The silence that fell over Bulldog's table was absolute. Even the general cafeteria noise seemed to dim, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Bulldog's men looked at each other, clearly unsure how to react. This was unprecedented territory, something outside the normal rules of prison economics and survival. Bulldog leaned back slowly, his chair creaking. He studied Mason for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, carrying an edge Mason couldn't quite identify. "In 17 years, I've seen a lot of stupid things in this place. Seen men give up everything for drugs, for protection, for revenge. Seen them sell their souls for an extra cigarette or a better work detail." He paused, his eyes boring into Mason's. "But I ain't never not once seen someone give up the only money they got for somebody else. Especially not for an old man who can't do nothing for them in return." "He shouldn't have to do anything in return," Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's a human being. He deserves to be treated like one." Something flickered across Bulldog's face, an emotion too quick to catch, there and gone in an instant. He looked past Mason to where Eddie Crawford sat alone at his table, trembling hands wrapped around a carton of milk he couldn't open. "You know what you're doing? Asking this?" Bulldog said. "You're putting yourself in a position. People are gonna talk. They're gonna wonder what angle you're working, what you're trying to prove. Some might see it as weakness. Others might see it as a threat to the natural order of things. Either way, you're painting a target on your back, and you ain't even got the $10 anymore to buy your way out of whatever comes next." "I know," Mason said. "I thought about that all night, but I can't be the kind of person who watches someone suffer when I could do something, even something small. My mom always said that's how you lose yourself. One small compromise at a time until there's nothing left of who you used to be." Bulldog was quiet for another long moment. Then, to everyone's shock, he smiled. A small, almost sad smile that transformed his face completely. "Your mom sounds like a smart woman. She know you're in here." "Yeah, she knows. She's the one who put the $10 in my account." "And you're giving it away?" "Yeah." Bulldog nodded slowly, then reached across the table and took the piece of paper from Mason's hand. "All right, Fish. You got yourself a deal. Eddie Crawford gets looked after. He'll get food he can eat, a clean cell, and nobody touches him. You got my word on that." Relief flooded through Mason, making him dizzy. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Bulldog said, his expression hardening again. "Because here's how this works. That $10, it bought Eddie 1 month. After that, the protection runs out unless you can come up with more. Can you do that?" Mason's relief evaporated. I don't have any more money. My family doesn't have anything to send. Then you better figure something out because I don't run a charity either. Bulldog stood up and his men immediately stood with him. But I'll tell you what, Fish. You just did something nobody else in this place would do. That's worth something, even if you don't know it yet. You're gonna find out real quick that every action in here has consequences. Let's see what kind of consequences your compassion brings. As Bulldog walked away, his men following like a small army, Mason stood there trying to process what had just happened. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Eddie Crawford would be okay, at least for now. But as he turned to walk back to his own table, he caught sight of faces watching him. Some confused, some angry, some calculating. The old man with the gang tattoos from yesterday, the Northside King's leader, was staring at him with an expression of pure contempt. Mason realized with a sinking feeling that Bulldog had been right. He'd just changed something fundamental in the delicate ecosystem of Blackwater Correctional. He'd thrown a stone into still waters, and now he had no idea what kind of ripples would come back to him. He sat down at an empty table, his hands shaking again, his dinner completely forgotten. Across the cafeteria, he saw one of Bulldog's men approach Eddie Crawford's table, say something to him, then help him open his milk carton. The old man looked up, confused, his watery eyes searching for an explanation he couldn't find. Mason allowed himself a small smile despite his fear. Whatever happened next, at least he'd done one good thing. At least he'd held onto a piece of his humanity in a place designed to strip it away. He just hoped he'd survive long enough to see if it made any difference. The night after Mason's encounter with Bulldog felt different. The cell block seemed quieter somehow, yet more tense, like the atmosphere before a storm. Mason lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in the cafeteria over and over, analyzing every word, every gesture, trying to understand what he'd set in motion. His cellmate hadn't said a word since they'd returned from dinner, which was somehow worse than the warnings he'd given earlier. Sleep came in fragments. 10 minutes here, 15 there, broken by the sounds of the prison at night and the anxious churning of his own thoughts. When the morning buzzer finally sounded, Mason felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. He went through the morning routine on autopilot, head count, shower, breakfast, moving like a ghost through the familiar motions. But everything had changed, even if the routine remained the same. At breakfast, Mason noticed it immediately. People were watching him differently, not with the casual predatory interest they'd shown the new fish yesterday, but with something else. Curiosity mixed with wariness, calculation mixed with confusion. He got his tray and scanned the cafeteria for a safe place to sit, acutely aware of the eyes tracking his movement. Then he saw Eddie Crawford and his breath caught. The old man was sitting at his usual isolated table, but he wasn't alone. One of Bulldog's men, the enforcer who'd initially intercepted Mason yesterday, sat across from him. The enforcer had brought Eddie a tray with what looked like actual food, oatmeal that wasn't lumpy, fruit that appeared fresh, toast that might actually be soft enough to chew. The enforcer was opening containers for Eddie, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he helped the trembling old man eat. Mason felt a strange mixture of emotions, relief, vindication, and something dangerously close to pride. He'd done that. His $10 had made that happen. For the first time since arriving at Blackwater, he'd accomplished something meaningful, something that mattered beyond mere survival. He was so focused on Eddie that he didn't notice the Northside King's member approaching until the man was right beside him. "You think you're special, Fish?" The man's voice was low, dangerous, meant only for Mason's ears. Up close, Mason could see prison ink covering every visible inch of skin, crude letters spelling out gang affiliations, teardrops marking kills, a spider web on the elbow indicating time served. "You think that little stunt yesterday makes you somebody?" Mason's mouth went dry. "I wasn't trying to be somebody. I was just trying to help an old man." "That's where you're wrong. Everything in here is about being somebody or being nobody. There ain't no in-between, and there definitely ain't no room for saints." The man leaned closer, his breath smelling of instant coffee and menthol cigarettes. "You made a play whether you know it or not. You got Bulldog's attention, that means you got everyone's attention. And attention in here? That's the most dangerous thing you can have." Before Mason could respond, the man walked away, leaving him standing there with his tray, his appetite completely gone. He found an empty corner table and forced himself to eat anyway, each bite tasting like ash. The cafeteria felt like it was closing in around him. The walls getting closer, the air getting thinner. The morning work shift at the laundry provided no relief. If anything, it was worse. Mason could feel the other inmates watching him, whispering when they thought he wasn't paying attention. During the mid-morning break, he overheard a conversation between two men sorting sheets at the next station. Heard he gave Bulldog his whole commissary account. $10. All of it. For what? Protection? That's the crazy part. Not for himself, for old Eddie Crawford. You believe that? Nobody does nothing for free in here. Fish must be working an angle. What angle? Eddie's got nothing. Kid's either stupid or playing some game we can't see yet. Mason kept his head down, his hands working mechanically, folding and sorting, trying to become invisible. But invisibility was no longer an option. He'd made himself visible yesterday, and now he had to live with the consequences. Lunch brought a new development. Mason entered the cafeteria to find Eddie Crawford sitting at a different table. Not alone in the corner, but at a table closer to the center of the room. Bulldog's enforcer was still with him, and now there was a second man as well, someone Mason didn't recognize who seemed to be having an actual conversation with the old man. Eddie's face, usually blank and defeated, showed traces of animation, his watery eyes focusing on something beyond his immediate suffering. Mason felt a warmth in his chest that almost made him forget his own fear. This was working. His crazy, stupid, potentially suicidal gesture was actually making a difference. Eddie Crawford wasn't invisible anymore. He was a person again, someone worth protecting, worth talking to, worth acknowledging as human. But as Mason got his food and searched for a place to sit, he realized his own situation had grown more complicated. Several inmates deliberately turned away as he approached their tables, making it clear he wasn't welcome. Others stared at him with open hostility. He finally found a spot at a table occupied by three men who seemed indifferent to his presence. Two white guys who looked like bikers and a quiet Native American man with graying braids. He was halfway through his meal when someone sat down directly across from him. Mason looked up and felt his stomach drop. It was Bulldog himself. The cafeteria didn't go silent. That would have been too obvious. But the quality of the noise changed. Conversations continued, but everyone was listening, watching, waiting to see what would happen. "Relax, Fish," Bulldog said, his voice surprisingly conversational. "I ain't here to shake you down or threaten you. I'm here because we need to talk, and we need to talk where everyone can see us talking." "Why?" Mason managed to ask, his voice barely steady. "Because you've created a situation, and situations need to be managed." Bulldog took a bite of his meatloaf, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. "See, what you did yesterday, that was pure. That was real. You didn't ask for nothing in return, didn't try to leverage it into something bigger. You saw someone suffering, and you tried to help, even though it cost you everything you had. That kind of thing is so rare in here that most people don't know how to process it." "I wasn't trying to make things complicated," Mason said. I know what you were trying to do, but here's what you need to understand. In a place like this, everything is transactional. Everything has value, and value can be traded, stolen, or leveraged. You broke that rule. You gave something for nothing, and that scares people because it doesn't fit their understanding of how things work." Bulldog leaned forward slightly. "Some people think you're stupid. Some think you're playing a long game they can't figure out yet. And some, and these are the dangerous ones, see you as a threat to the natural order." "I'm not a threat to anyone," Mason protested. "I just wanted to help an old man eat decent food." "That's exactly what makes you a threat." Bulldog's eyes were intense now, boring into Mason's. "You reminded people that there's another way to be even in here. You showed compassion in a place where compassion is considered weakness. That makes people uncomfortable. And when people get uncomfortable in prison, bad things happen." Mason felt cold despite the humid warmth of the cafeteria. "What kind of bad things?" "That depends on how smart you are and how quickly you learn." Bulldog pushed his tray aside and folded his hands on the table. "I'm going to give you some advice, and you better listen close because I ain't in the habit of repeating myself. First, Eddie Crawford is protected now. My word is good, and that protection holds as long as I'm running things. But that protection don't extend to you unless you earn it. How do I earn it? That's the second thing. You want to survive in here with your soul intact. And yeah, I noticed that's important to you. Then you need to be useful. You got skills on the outside?" Mason thought about his life before Blackwater, before the armed robbery that had destroyed everything. "I was studying accounting at community college. I'm good with numbers, organization, keeping track of things." Something flickered in Bulldog's expression. Interest, maybe even approval. "Numbers, organization, that's good, that's real good. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider something. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to start helping with my operations. Nothing illegal, nothing that'll get you in trouble with the administration, but I got legitimate business interests in here that need managing. Commissary accounts, loan tracking, payment schedules. I need someone who's good with details, someone who won't skim, someone who's too stupid to lie because they got some moral compass that won't let them. You want me to be your accountant?" Mason couldn't keep the surprise out of his voice. "I want you to be useful. That's how you stay safe in here. By making yourself valuable to the right people. You do good work for me. You stay out of trouble. You keep your head down. And maybe you make it through your 8 years without losing who you are." Bulldog stood up, picking up his tray. "But understand this, Fish. The moment you try to play me, the moment you think you're smarter than you are, the moment you forget that compassion without wisdom gets you killed, that's when my protection ends and you're on your own. We clear?" "We're clear," Mason said, his mind racing to process this unexpected turn of events. "Good. One of my people will come get you after dinner, take you where we conduct business. You'll start tonight." Bulldog started to walk away, then paused and looked back. "And Fish? What you did for Eddie, that was good. Foolish, maybe, but good. Don't lose that. This place needs more of that, even if it don't know it yet." After Bulldog left, the cafeteria slowly returned to normal, though Mason could still feel eyes on him, could still sense the undercurrent of curiosity and calculation flowing through the room. He finished his meal mechanically, trying to understand what had just happened. He'd gone from being a nobody new Fish to being under Bulldog's wing, all because he'd given away $10 to help an old man. The afternoon work shift passed in a blur. Mason's mind was elsewhere, thinking about what the evening would bring, what kind of operations Bulldog ran, what he was getting himself into. Part of him knew he was in deeper now than ever before, that accepting Bulldog's offer was another step down a path he might not be able to back away from later. But another part, the part that had made him approach Bulldog in the first place, told him this was an opportunity, maybe the only one he'd get to make something positive out of his time in Blackwater. That evening after dinner, as promised, one of Bulldog's men came to Mason's cell. It was the enforcer who'd been helping Eddie, the massive man with the split eyebrow scar. Up close, he was even more intimidating, his presence filling the small cell like a physical force. "Name's Marcus," the man said, his voice a deep rumble. "I'm Bulldog's right hand. You're coming with me." Mason's cellmate looked up from his bunk, his expression unreadable but his eyes showing something that might have been respect or might have been pity. Mason couldn't tell which. Marcus led Mason through the cell block, down a flight of stairs, through a corridor Mason hadn't been in before. They passed the library, the chapel, the administrative offices that were closed for the evening. Finally, they reached a door marked Recreation Storage. Marcus knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 more times in quick succession, obviously a code. The door opened from the inside, and Mason found himself in a large storage room that had been converted into something else entirely. One corner had been set up as an office of sorts. A table, several chairs, filing boxes stacked neatly, and most surprisingly, an old desktop computer that looked like it had been salvaged from the administrative offices. Bulldog sat at the table, along with 3 other men Mason recognized from his inner circle. They were reviewing papers, discussing something in low voices. When Mason entered, they all looked up. "Welcome to the real Blackwater," Bulldog said, gesturing for Mason to sit. "This is where the actual business of this place gets conducted. The guards and the warden, they think they run this prison, but we both know different, don't we? They control the locks and the walls. We control everything else." Mason sat down, his heart hammering. On the table in front of him were ledgers, actual physical ledgers filled with neat columns of numbers, names, dates, amounts. It was a complex system of transactions, loans, payments, debts, and credits. "This is my empire," Bulldog said, spreading his hands over the ledgers. "Everything that moves in this place, every cigarette, every favor, every bit of contraband, every protection agreement, it all gets tracked here. The previous guy who managed this for me, he's getting out next week. Lucky bastard made parole. That leaves me with a hole that needs filling, and you, Fish, just volunteered to fill it." Mason looked at the ledgers, his accounting training kicking in automatically. Even at a glance, he could see the system was sophisticated. Color-coded entries, cross-referenced accounts, built-in redundancies to prevent errors. This wasn't the work of a thug. This was the work of someone who understood business at a fundamental level. "You built this?" Mason asked, unable to hide his surprise. Bulldog smiled that rare smile again, the one that transformed his face. I was a CPA on the outside before I killed the man who was sleeping with my wife. 25 years they gave me and I've served 17. In here I use the same skills, just different applications. So yeah, I built this. And now you're going to help me maintain it. For the next 2 hours, Bulldog walked Mason through the system, explaining the codes, the accounts, the balancing mechanisms, the dispute resolution protocols. It was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. A fully functioning underground economy with its own rules, its own currency, its own justice system. As the evening wore on and Marcus eventually led Mason back to his cell, Mason realized something profound had shifted. He'd come to Blackwater as a nobody, a scared kid who'd made a stupid mistake. But in just 2 days, through one act of compassion and one demonstration of useful skills, he'd become part of something larger. He wasn't sure if that something was good or bad, wasn't sure if he was being protected or exploited, saved or corrupted. But as he climbed onto his bunk that night, exhausted and overwhelmed, he thought about Eddie Crawford eating real food, sitting at a better table, being treated like a human being instead of a ghost. And he thought that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to navigate this dark world without losing himself completely. He just had to hope he was right. 3 weeks passed, and Mason fell into a routine that would have seemed impossible during his first terrifying day at Blackwater. Every morning after breakfast, he reported to work at the laundry facility, but his afternoons and evenings now belonged to Bulldog's operation. The storage room had become his second home, a strange sanctuary where numbers made sense and order could be imposed on the chaos of prison life. Mason discovered he had a talent for this work. His accounting classes had given him the theoretical foundation, but managing Bulldog's ledgers taught him practical skills no textbook could provide. He learned to read between the lines, to spot patterns in the transactions that might indicate trouble brewing, to anticipate problems before they materialized. Within 2 weeks, he'd reorganized the entire filing system, created backup records, and implemented a color-coded alert system for accounts that were becoming problematic. Bulldog noticed. "You got a gift for this, Fish," he said one evening, reviewing Mason's latest reports. "Most people, they just see numbers. You see stories. You see what the numbers are trying to tell you about human behavior. That's rare. The work came with benefits." Mason's commissary account, which he'd emptied for Eddie Crawford, began receiving mysterious deposits. Nothing huge, $5 here, $10 there, but enough that he could buy decent soap, extra food, the occasional magazine. When he'd tried to refuse the first deposit, Bulldog had cut him off. "You work, you get paid. That's how legitimate business operates. You want to give your money away after you earn it, that's your choice, but you ain't working for free. I don't run a charity, and I don't exploit labor. We clear?" They were clear. Eddie Crawford thrived under the protection Mason had purchased with his original $10. The old man had gained weight. His hands trembled less, and most remarkably, he'd started talking again. Mason learned that Eddie had been a college professor on the outside, literature and philosophy, before a drunk driving accident had killed a family of 4. He'd been in Blackwater for 32 years, serving a life sentence, and somewhere along the way, he'd simply given up on living, becoming a ghost haunting the edges of the prison ecosystem. Now, with regular meals and basic dignity restored, Eddie was remembering who he used to be. He'd started spending time in the library, organizing books, helping younger inmates improve their reading skills. Bulldog's enforcer Marcus had taken a particular interest in Eddie, often sitting with the old man during meals, listening to stories about philosophy and literature that Marcus absorbed like a student desperate for knowledge he'd been denied. But not everyone was happy about the changes. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning, 4 weeks after Mason's arrival. He was in the laundry room sorting through a load of sheets, when 2 members of the Northside Kings cornered him near the industrial dryers. One was the man who'd confronted him at breakfast that first week, the one with the tear tattoos and spiderweb elbow. The other was younger, maybe Mason's age, with dead eyes that suggested he'd already seen and done things that had burned out whatever humanity he'd started with. "We need to have a conversation, Fish," the older one said, positioning himself so that his body blocked the view of the guard stationed at the entrance. "About your arrangement with Bulldog." Mason's heart rate spiked, but he forced himself to remain calm, remembering advice Marcus had given him. "Show fear in here, and you're done. Doesn't matter if you're terrified inside. Outside, you gotta be stone." "I don't have an arrangement with Bulldog," Mason said evenly. "I work for him, same as dozens of other people in this place." "Nah, see, that ain't quite right. The younger king moved closer, his voice barely above a whisper. You got special treatment. You got his attention. That means you got something we want. I don't have anything, Mason insisted. I keep his books, that's it. His books. Exactly. The older king smiled, showing teeth that had seen better days. We want to know what's in those books. Specifically, we want to know who owes what to whom, who's paying protection, who's got money coming in from outside. That information, that's valuable. That's the kind of thing that could shift the balance of power in this place. Mason felt ice forming in his stomach. You're asking me to betray Bulldog's trust. We're asking you to be smart. Bulldog, he's been running things a long time, but nothing lasts forever. The Northside Kings were growing stronger every day. New members coming in, alliances forming. Eventually, there's going to be a shift, a change in management. When that happens, you want to be on the winning side. The older king leaned closer, his breath hot against Mason's face. We're giving you a chance to choose now, while you still can. Give us what we want, and when things change, you'll be protected. Refuse, and when the shift comes, you're gonna wish you'd been smarter. And if I tell Bulldog about this conversation? Mason asked, though he already knew the answer. The younger king's dead eyes didn't blink. Then you better hope his protection is as good as he says it is. But accidents happen in laundry rooms. Heavy machinery, slippery floors, so many ways a clumsy new fish could get hurt real bad. The guards, they can't be everywhere. And Bulldog, powerful as he is, he can't protect you every second of every day. They walked away, leaving Mason standing there with his heart hammering and his hands shaking. He forced himself to finish his work shift, moving mechanically through the remaining hours, his mind racing through his options. He could tell Bulldog, should tell Bulldog, but that would declare open war between him and the Northside Kings. He could try to ignore the threat, hope they were bluffing, but the dead certainty in the younger king's eyes suggested they weren't. Or he could give them something. Not everything they wanted, but enough to buy time while he figured out what to do. That evening, as he sat in the storage room updating ledgers, Mason found himself distracted, making mistakes he normally wouldn't make. Bulldog noticed. Something on your mind, Mason? It was the first time Bulldog had used his actual name instead of calling him Fish. You've been staring at that same page for 10 minutes. Mason looked up, meeting Bulldog's eyes. In that moment, he made a decision. The same kind of decision that had led him to give away his $10 in the first place. He couldn't live with himself if he betrayed the man who'd not only protected Eddie Crawford, but had given Mason himself a chance to be useful, to matter, to maintain some dignity in this hellhole. The Northside Kings approached me today, Mason said quietly. They want information from the ledgers. They threatened me if I don't cooperate. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Marcus, who'd been standing by the door, straightened up, his massive frame tensing. Two other enforcers who'd been reviewing accounts stopped what they were doing. Bulldog's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went very cold, very dangerous. Tell me everything, Bulldog said. Every word, every gesture. Don't leave nothing out. Mason recounted the entire conversation, from the positioning near the dryers to block the guard's view, to the specific threats about accidents, to the talk of a coming shift in power. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Bulldog spoke. You did right telling me. Took guts, especially knowing what could happen if the Kings find out you talked. But now we got a situation that needs addressing. I'm sorry, Mason said. I brought this on by what? By being good at your job? By making yourself valuable? Nah, this ain't on you. Bulldog stood up, pacing the small room like a caged predator. The Kings have been pushing boundaries for months now, testing to see how far they can go before I push back. They're using you because they think you're weak, think you're an easy target. They're wrong. What are you going to do? Mason asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. First, you're getting round-the-clock protection. Marcus, from now on, Mason don't go nowhere without one of our people within sight. Work detail, meals, showers, everything. We make it clear he's under our umbrella. Bulldog turned to Mason. Second, you keep doing your job like nothing happened. Don't change your routine. Don't show fear. Don't give them the satisfaction of knowing they rattled you. And the Kings? Marcus asked, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he already knew the answer and approved. The Kings are going to learn a lesson about respect and boundaries. But we do this smart, not emotional. We don't want a full-scale war. That brings heat from the administration, gets people sent to solitary, disrupts business. We need to respond in a way that's clear but contained. Bulldog's eyes narrowed. I'll handle it personal. Send word I want to sit down with their leadership tomorrow after lunch. Neutral ground. The chapel. 5 people each side. We're going to have a conversation about appropriate business practices. That night, Mason barely slept. His cellmate, who'd witnessed Marcus escorting him back and stationing himself outside their cell, finally broke his usual silence. You really stepped in it now, Fish? Bulldog versus the Northside Kings. That's the kind of thing that gets people killed. I know, Mason whispered into the darkness. Was it worth it? The old man, the moral stand? All of it? Was it worth ending up in the middle of a gang war? Mason thought about Eddie Crawford, sitting at a decent table, eating real food, teaching young inmates to read, reclaiming his humanity one day at a time. He thought about the ledgers he maintained, the order he brought to chaos, the sense of purpose that made each day bearable. He thought about the person he wanted to be versus the person this place was designed to turn him into. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, it was worth it. His cellmate was quiet for a moment. Then you're either the bravest person I've met in here, or the dumbest. Maybe both. Get some sleep, Fish. Tomorrow's gonna be a long day. The next morning moved with the slow inevitability of a train approaching a broken bridge. Mason went through his routine with Marcus shadowing him everywhere, a massive, silent presence that made other inmates give them both a wide berth. At breakfast, he saw Eddie Crawford at his usual table, the old man smiling and chatting with other inmates who'd started sitting with him, drawn by his stories and gentle wisdom. Eddie caught Mason's eye and waved, and Mason managed a small wave back, thinking that whatever happened today, at least he'd accomplished something good. Lunch came too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Mason forced himself to eat, knowing he'd need the energy, though everything tasted like cardboard. He watched as Bulldog entered the cafeteria right on schedule, surrounded by Marcus and 4 other enforcers. The Northside Kings leadership entered moments later, 5 men including the 2 who'd threatened Mason, all carrying themselves with the aggressive confidence of people who believed they were about to shift the balance of power. The chapel was a small room at the end of D Block, used for services on Sundays and prayer meetings during the week. Now it served as neutral ground, a place where even the most violent inmates observed an unofficial truce. Mason wasn't invited to attend the meeting. This was above his pay grade, but Marcus had positioned him in a cell within earshot, with instructions to stay put and stay quiet. Through the walls, Mason could hear voices, though he couldn't make out specific words. The tone started calm, almost conversational, then gradually rose. There was a long silence, then a voice, Bulldog's, cutting through sharp and clear. You will not threaten my people. You will not interfere with my operations. And you will sure as hell not mistake my patience for weakness. Another silence, longer this time. Then a different voice, younger, angrier. Your time is ending, old man. This place is changing, and you're too blind to see it. What happened next, Mason heard clearly because Bulldog's voice carried with absolute authority. Let me tell you about time, boy. I've been in this place 17 years. 17 years of managing, negotiating, maintaining order in a place designed to create chaos. You think because you got some new members, some younger blood that makes you ready to take what I built? You ain't learned the most important lesson yet. Power ain't about who's willing to be the most violent. It's about who's willing to be the most patient, the most strategic, the most necessary. A new voice joined in. The older king with the tear tattoos. Big words. But words don't change facts. We're growing stronger. Your empire is built on respect, and respect is all about perception. People start thinking you're weak, that you can't protect your own people, and that respect evaporates. You think threatening a kid who keeps my books makes you look strong? Bulldog's laugh was harsh, mocking. It makes you look desperate. It makes you look like you're grasping at straws because you don't got the skills to compete legitimate. Mason Willis is under my protection now, explicit and absolute. You touch him, you look at him wrong, you so much as breathe in his direction, and I will take that as a declaration of war. And trust me, you don't want that war. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, voices rising and falling, threats veiled and explicit, negotiations happening in the coded language of prison politics. Finally, Mason heard footsteps, the sound of the chapel door opening and closing multiple times. Marcus appeared at the cell doorway. It's done, he said simply. Come on. Mason followed Marcus back to the storage room, where Bulldog was already waiting, looking tired, but satisfied. The other enforcers filtered in over the next few minutes, all wearing similar expressions of relief mixed with residual tension. "What happened?" Mason asked. "Are we at war?" "No," Bulldog said. "We avoided that barely. I made it clear that you're untouchable, that any move against you is a move against me personally." The Kings agreed to back off, not because they wanted to, but because they know they ain't ready for full confrontation yet. They're still building, still consolidating. They need more time, and I gave them an out that let them retreat without losing too much face. What kind of out? Doesn't matter. Point is, you're safe. They won't touch you now, not directly. Bulldog paused, his expression darkening. But understand something, Mason. This bought us time, not a solution. The Kings are ambitious, and ambition in here is like a cancer. It just keeps growing until something cuts it out. Eventually there will be a reckoning, and when that day comes, everyone's gonna have to choose a side. What side will I be on? Mason asked, though he already knew the answer. You're one of mine now. That's been true since the moment you gave up your $10 for an old man you didn't even know. You showed me something that day, something rare and precious in a place like this. You showed me that goodness still exists, that compassion ain't completely dead, that there are still people who'll sacrifice for others without expecting nothing in return. Bulldog's expression softened slightly. That's worth protecting, Mason. You're worth protecting. Not just because you're useful with the ledgers, but because people like you remind people like me why we bother maintaining order instead of just letting this place burn. That evening, Mason sat in his cell, processing everything that had happened. His cellmate watched him for a while before finally speaking. You know what I realized about you, Fish? You're dangerous. Not in the way the Kings are dangerous or even the way Bulldog's dangerous. You're dangerous because you make people want to be better than they are. You make them remember they used to be human beings with consciences and morals. In a place like this, that's the most disruptive thing you can possibly be. Mason thought about that as he lay on his bunk that night. Was it true? Had his simple act of compassion for Eddie Crawford really disrupted something fundamental in Blackwater's ecosystem? And if so, what were the ultimate consequences going to be? He didn't have answers yet, but he was beginning to understand that he'd started something the day he'd approached Bulldog with his $10. Something that was still unfolding, still rippling outward, still changing the dynamics of this dark place in ways no one could fully predict. For better or worse, Mason Willis was no longer invisible. He was no longer just another terrified new fish trying to survive. He was something else now. A symbol, maybe, or a catalyst. And in Blackwater Correctional Facility, being either of those things was both an honor and a death sentence. He just had to hope he could navigate the difference. 2 months into his sentence, Mason had become a fixture in Blackwater's complex social structure. He moved through the prison with the confidence of someone who understood the rules, who had a place and a purpose. Marcus's shadow had become permanent. The massive enforcer rarely left Mason's side during waking hours, a silent guardian whose mere presence deterred most potential threats. But Mason knew that protection came with a price tag that hadn't been fully calculated yet. The ledgers had grown more complex under Mason's management. What started as simple transaction records had evolved into a comprehensive database of the prison's entire underground economy. Mason had created categories, subcategories, trend analyses, and predictive models that could forecast potential conflicts before they erupted. Bulldog relied on these reports increasingly, using Mason's insights to make decisions that affected hundreds of inmates. You got a mind for this, Bulldog told him one evening as they reviewed the latest numbers. You see patterns nobody else sees. Like here, he pointed to a series of transactions Mason had flagged in red. You noticed these 3 accounts all went into debt at the same time, all for similar amounts. What's that tell you? Mason had learned to think like Bulldog, to see human drama in columns of numbers. It tells me someone's running a coordinated operation. They borrowed from different sources simultaneously, probably planning something that requires capital they don't have. Could be drugs coming in, could be planning an escape, could be consolidating power for a move against someone. The Northside Kings, Bulldog said quietly. These 3 accounts, they're all Kings. They're building something and they're doing it careful, spreading the risk across multiple creditors so no single person sees the whole picture. He looked at Mason with genuine respect. Except you saw it. You put it together. That same evening, something unprecedented happened. Eddie Crawford asked to meet with Bulldog privately. Mason was present when the old man shuffled into the storage room, looking nervous but determined. His hands still trembled, but his eyes were clear and focused in a way they hadn't been when Mason first arrived. Mr. Calder, Eddie began formally, his voice carrying traces of the professor he used to be. "I wanted to thank you personally for the kindness you've shown me these past months. The food, the protection, the simple dignity of being treated as a human being. These things have given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "Don't thank me," Bulldog said gruffly. "Thank Mason here. He's the one who spent his last dime on your behalf." Eddie turned to Mason, and there were tears in the old man's eyes. "I know, and I've been trying to figure out why. Why a young man I'd never spoken to would sacrifice everything to help me. I've been watching you, Mason, trying to understand. And what I've realized is that you did it because it was right, because you saw suffering and refused to look away. That's rare. That's precious. You don't owe me anything, Eddie," Mason said quietly. "I just couldn't stand watching you suffer alone, invisible, forgotten." Eddie smiled sadly. "I was dead, Mason. Still breathing, still moving, but dead inside. You brought me back to life, and now I want to repay that debt." "There's no debt," Mason insisted. Nevertheless, Eddie straightened his shoulders, and for a moment, Mason could see the professor he'd been, commanding a classroom with authority and wisdom. "I've spent 32 years in this place. I know things. I see things. People forget I exist, so they talk around me like I'm furniture. And what I've been seeing lately concerns me greatly." Bulldog leaned forward, suddenly very attentive. "What kind of things?" "The Northside Kings are planning something significant. I don't know all the details, but I've overheard conversations in the library, seen meetings in corners they think are private. They're recruiting heavily, making promises, building alliances with smaller groups who've traditionally been neutral. There's talk of a new order of changing how things work in Blackwater." Eddie paused, choosing his words carefully. "And there's talk about you, Mr. Calder. About your age, about whether you still have the strength to maintain control. They're testing boundaries, looking for weaknesses." "I know about the Kings," Bulldog said. "Been watching them for months, but what else? What am I missing?" Eddie glanced at Mason, then back to Bulldog. "They're targeting your key people. Not violently, they learned that lesson, but psychologically. They're spreading rumors, creating doubts, making offers to your enforcers when they think no one's listening. They're trying to erode loyalty from the inside piece by piece, and they're being patient about it, which makes them more dangerous than if they'd just started a shooting war." The room fell silent as Bulldog processed this information. Mason could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, strategies forming and reforming as new data integrated with old patterns. "Who specifically?" Bulldog asked finally. "Which of my people are they targeting?" "I don't have all the names," Eddie admitted, "but I've seen them talking to Big Tommy from laundry detail, to Carlos from the kitchen crew, to that young man with the scar on his jaw. I don't know his name." "Dante," Bulldog said quietly, and something in his voice suggested this was worse than Mason had realized. "Dante's been with me 6 years. He's one of my most trusted enforcers." "I could be wrong," Eddie said quickly. "I'm just reporting what I've observed, but I thought you should know." After Eddie left, Bulldog sat in silence for several minutes, his fingers drumming on the table in a rhythm that suggested deep thought. Marcus and the other enforcers waited, understanding that their leader was processing, planning, deciding on a course of action. "Marcus," Bulldog finally said, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it quiet. Watch Dante. Don't let him know you're watching, don't tell the others what you're doing, but keep eyes on him 24/7. I need to know who he talks to, where he goes, what he does when he thinks nobody's paying attention." "You really think Dante would flip?" Marcus asked, and there was genuine pain in his voice. Loyalty meant everything in Bulldog's organization, and betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. "I don't know, but I can't afford to assume loyalty when there's evidence suggesting otherwise. Eddie's earned trust by being right about things before. We take this serious until we prove it ain't." Bulldog turned to Mason. "I need you to go through the ledgers again. Look at Dante's transactions for the past 6 months. See if there's anything unusual, any patterns that don't fit his normal behavior. Can you do that?" "Yeah," Mason said. "I'll start tonight." Over the next week, Mason dove deep into the financial records, cross-referencing transactions, building timelines, looking for anomalies. What he found disturbed him. Dante's account showed irregular deposits starting about 3 months ago. Nothing huge, but consistent. Small amounts that could be explained as winnings from card games or payment for small favors. But the timing suggested something else. The deposits increased after meetings between Bulldog and the Northside Kings, increased again after periods of tension or conflict. Mason created a visual chart. mapping Dante's financial activity against major events in the prison's power structure. The correlation was undeniable. Someone was paying Dante for information, and the pattern suggested it was the king's. When Mason showed Bulldog the evidence, the older man's face became a mask of stone. "How sure are you about this?" 90%, Mason said. "The pattern's too consistent to be coincidence. He's being paid for something, and the timing matches exactly with intelligence the kings would find valuable. Marcus's surveillance confirms it," Bulldog added grimly. "Dante's been having conversations in the yard with king leadership. Brief, careful, but they're happening. He's playing both sides, taking my protection while selling me out to my enemies." "What are you going to do?" Mason asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "What I have to do, what anyone in my position would do." Bulldog stood up, his expression harder than Mason had ever seen it. "But I'm going to do it smart. Dante's betrayal, that's bad, but it's also an opportunity. If he's feeding information to the kings, that means we can feed him information we want them to have. We can use him to set a trap." Over the next 2 weeks, Bulldog ran a masterclass in strategic deception, through carefully staged conversations that Dante was allowed to overhear, through documents left where he could access them, through rumors planted in his vicinity. Bulldog fed his traitorous enforcer false information about a major shipment of contraband supposedly coming into the prison. According to the planted intelligence, Bulldog had arranged for a large quantity of drugs and cell phones to be smuggled in through the kitchen, hidden in a food delivery arriving on a specific date and time. Mason watched the operation unfold with a mixture of fascination and dread. He saw how Bulldog manipulated information flows, how he used Dante's betrayal against him, how he anticipated exactly how the kings would respond to the false intelligence. It was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. "They'll try to intercept the shipment," Bulldog explained to his inner circle, minus Dante, 3 days before the supposed delivery. "They'll want to steal it, both for the value of the contraband and for the symbolic victory of taking something right out from under me. It'll make them look strong, make me look weak. That's the play they can't resist." "But there is no shipment," Marcus said, understanding dawning on his face. "So when they make their move, they'll expose themselves completely. They'll show us everyone who's working with them, everyone who's willing to cross that line. And more importantly, they'll commit resources to an operation that leaves them vulnerable elsewhere." Bulldog's smile was cold and calculating. "While they're focused on the kitchen, trying to steal something that doesn't exist, we'll be making moves of our own, calling in debts, reshuffling alliances, demonstrating strength where it actually matters." The night before the supposed delivery, Mason worked late in the storage room, updating ledgers and preparing for whatever was about to happen. Eddie Crawford appeared at the door looking worried. "Mason, I need to tell you something. The kings, they're planning something bigger than stealing a shipment. I overheard them in the library tonight talking when they thought I couldn't hear. They're planning to move against Bulldog directly. Tomorrow, when everyone's distracted by the kitchen situation, they're going to challenge him, publicly, in the yard. They're going to force a confrontation that will determine who really runs this place." Mason felt ice in his stomach. "Does Bulldog know? I came here first. I wanted to tell you both at the same time." They found Bulldog in his cell, reviewing his own notes for tomorrow's operation. When Eddie shared what he'd heard, Bulldog was quiet for a long moment. "A public challenge," he said finally. "In front of everyone. Winner takes all." He looked at Eddie with genuine gratitude. "You just saved my life, old man. If they'd caught me unprepared, caught me looking weak in front of the whole prison." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Everyone understood that leadership in Blackwater was maintained through a combination of strategic intelligence and perceived strength. Lose the second while demonstrating the first, and the whole structure collapsed. "What are you going to do?" Mason asked. "What I should have done weeks ago. I'm going to end this before it gets any worse." Bulldog stood up, his posture straight, his expression resolute. "Tomorrow when the kings make their move, I'll be ready. Not just ready to respond, but ready to finish this once and for all. They want a new order? They want to challenge my authority? Fine. Let's settle it in front of everyone. Let's see whose vision for this place actually wins." That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, thinking about how his simple act of compassion for an old man had set in motion a chain of events that was now culminating in a showdown that would determine the future of Blackwater's power structure. He thought about Eddie Crawford, who'd been brought back to life only to become a key intelligence asset in a prison gang war. He thought about Bulldog, who'd shown him that even in the darkest places, People could maintain codes of honor and principles, however twisted those principles might be. And he thought about himself, about the person he'd been when he walked through those gates 2 months ago, terrified and lost, and the person he'd become. He'd wanted to hold on to his humanity, to remain compassionate in a place designed to strip away compassion. But in doing so, he'd become part of a system that was fundamentally about power, control, and violence. However strategic that violence might be, had he made the right choice? Had his $10 for Eddie Crawford been worth everything that followed? He still didn't know. But tomorrow, in the harsh light of the prison yard, with the entire population of Blackwater watching, the consequences of that choice would finally come to their conclusion. For better or worse, Mason Willis had changed things. Now he was going to find out what kind of change he'd actually created. His cellmate's voice cut through the darkness. "You awake?" "Yeah. Tomorrow's gonna be bad. Whatever happens in that yard, blood's gonna spill. You ready for that?" Mason thought about it honestly. "No, but I don't think you can ever really be ready for something like this." "Maybe not. But you can decide who you're gonna be when it happens. You can decide if you're gonna hide or if you're gonna stand. That's the only choice that really matters." Mason closed his eyes, knowing his cellmate was right. Tomorrow, he'd have to choose. And whatever he chose would define not just his future in Blackwater, but the kind of person he was going to become. He just hoped he had the courage to choose right. The morning of the confrontation dawned gray and cold, the kind of overcast day that seemed to drain color from the world and leave everything looking like a faded photograph. Mason woke before the buzzer, his body tense with anticipation, his mind racing through scenarios he couldn't control. He lay on his bunk listening to his cellmate's breathing, counting the seconds until everything changed. When the buzzer finally sounded, Mason moved through his morning routine like a man walking to his own execution. Shower, dress, breakfast. Each action felt weighted with significance, as if it might be the last time he performed it in this particular reality. The cafeteria buzzed with an undercurrent of tension that even inmates who didn't know what was coming could feel. Something was in the air, something electric and dangerous that made people speak in lower voices and watch the doors more carefully. Eddie Crawford caught Mason's eye across the cafeteria and nodded once, a gesture of solidarity, of shared understanding. The old man looked different this morning, more alert, more present, as if the danger had sharpened him somehow. Mason nodded back, grateful for the connection, for the reminder of why he'd started down this path in the first place. Bulldog was absent from breakfast, which was unusual. His table sat empty, his enforcers scattered throughout the cafeteria rather than clustered together. Mason understood this was tactical. They were spreading out, positioning themselves for what was coming, making it harder for the Kings to track their movements or anticipate their responses. The morning work shift was a blur. Mason went through the motions at the laundry facility, sorting and folding with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to stay calm. Marcus was there, closer than usual, his massive presence a reassurance and a reminder that violence was coming. "Stay close to me when we hit the yard," Marcus said quietly during a moment when no one else was nearby. "Whatever happens, you stay behind me. Bulldog wants you protected. You're too valuable to risk." "I'm not going to hide while other people fight," Mason said, surprising himself with his own conviction. Marcus looked at him with something like respect. "That's not what I said. I said stay close. There's a difference between hiding and being smart. You ain't a fighter, Mason. You're a thinker. Thinkers don't belong on the front lines. They belong where they can see what's happening and figure out what to do next. That's your job today. Watch, think, survive." The lunch buzzer sounded at noon, and the entire prison population began moving toward the cafeteria. But today was different. Today, instead of going inside after eating, inmates would have their daily hour of yard time, and everyone knew that's when it would happen. The yard was the only place in Blackwater large enough for the kind of public confrontation the Kings were planning. It was also the place where guards had the least control, where the prison's internal politics played out in their rawest form. Mason forced himself to eat, though every bite felt like swallowing stones. Around him, conversations were muted, eyes constantly scanning, bodies positioned for quick movement. The Kings were visible across the cafeteria, a larger group than usual, maybe 20 men, all wearing expressions of barely contained anticipation. Their leader, the man with the tear tattoos who'd threatened Mason in the laundry room weeks ago, sat at the center of the group, radiating confidence. And then Bulldog entered. He walked alone, which was unprecedented. No enforcers flanking him. No entourage of advisors and lieutenants. Just Ray Bulldog Calder, 53 years old, 17 years into a life sentence, walking through the cafeteria like he owned every inch of it. He moved to the food line, got his tray, and sat down at his usual table, alone. The message was clear. He wasn't afraid. He didn't need protection. He was ready for whatever was coming. Mason watched the king's leader react to this display, saw the flicker of uncertainty quickly masked by renewed aggression. The man hadn't expected Bulldog to show such confidence. He'd expected to catch his opponent on the defensive, surrounded by nervous enforcers, already looking weak before the confrontation even began. The hour in the yard came too quickly. Inmates filed outside, dispersing across the concrete expanse with its basketball courts, weight stations, and scattered benches. The sky remained gray, heavy clouds pressing down like a lid on a boiling pot. Guards took their positions along the perimeter, watchful but maintaining their usual distance, close enough to respond to obvious violence, far enough to allow the prison's internal politics to operate. Mason stayed close to Marcus as instructed, positioning himself near the weight station where he could see most of the yard. Eddie Crawford was nearby, sitting on a bench with a book he wasn't reading, his watery eyes scanning the crowd with an alertness that belied his frail appearance. The confrontation began almost casually. The king's leader, Mason had learned his name was Victor Reyes, walked toward the center of the yard, followed by his 20 men. They formed a loose semicircle, facing the spot where Bulldog stood alone, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Calder, Victor's voice carried across the yard, silencing conversations, drawing every eye. We need to talk about the future of this place. Bulldog didn't move, didn't react. He simply waited, letting Victor come to him, forcing the younger man to cross the distance and show his hand first. Victor stopped about 10 feet away, his men spreading out behind him. You've been running things here a long time. Too long. This place needs new leadership, new ideas, new blood. The old ways don't work anymore. The old ways built everything you're standing on, Bulldog said calmly. The economy, the protection systems, the order that keeps this place from turning into complete chaos. You think you can do better? You think your kings have what it takes to maintain what I've built? We don't want to maintain it. We want to tear it down and build something new. Victor's voice rose, playing to the crowd now, performing for the hundreds of inmates who'd stopped whatever they were doing to watch. You've gotten soft, Calder. Protecting old men nobody cares about. Taking in greenfish and treating them like they're special. You've lost touch with what this place really needs. Mason felt those words like a punch to the gut. Victor was using him, using Eddie, as evidence of Bulldog's weakness. The very acts of compassion that had drawn Mason into Bulldog's orbit were being weaponized against them both. But Bulldog just smiled. That rare, cold smile that Mason had learned to recognize as dangerous. Soft. That's what you think. Let me tell you something about soft, Victor. Soft is making moves against someone without understanding who they really are. Soft is thinking that numbers alone make you powerful. Soft is not realizing that the man you've been paying to spy on me has been feeding you exactly what I wanted you to hear. The crowd murmured. Victor's expression flickered with uncertainty. What are you talking about? Dante, Bulldog called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Come here. From somewhere in the crowd, Dante emerged, the enforcer who'd been selling information to the kings for months. But he wasn't walking toward Victor. He was walking toward Bulldog, his head bowed, his posture that of a man confessing his sins. Tell them, Bulldog said quietly. Tell them everything. Tell them. Dante turned to face the crowd and his voice shook as he spoke. I was working for the kings, selling information, reporting on Bulldog's operations, helping them plan their moves. But 3 weeks ago, Bulldog found out. He gave me a choice: keep pretending to work for the kings while actually feeding them false information, or face the consequences of betrayal. I chose to make things right. Victor's face contorted with rage. You're lying. This is a setup. The shipment you were planning to intercept this morning? Bulldog's voice was almost gentle now. There was no shipment. There was never going to be a shipment. You sent 15 of your men to the kitchen to steal something that didn't exist, which means right now, you're standing here with only 20 soldiers instead of 35. Meanwhile, he raised his hand. From all directions, Bulldog's enforcers emerged from the crowd. Not just the 5 or 6 who usually accompanied him, but dozens. Men Mason had never seen associate with Bulldog, men who'd apparently been secret allies all along. They formed their own semicircle, surrounding the kings, outnumbering them nearly 2 to 1. You wanted to challenge my authority? Bulldog stepped forward, his voice hardening. You wanted to tear down what I've built and replace it with your own vision? Fine. Let's see whose vision actually has support. Let's see who the population of this prison wants running things. The yard had gone completely silent. Every inmate, every guard, every person in Blackwater was watching, waiting to see how this would end. The Kings were trapped, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Their secret weapon turned against them. Their surprise attack diffused before it could begin. Victor Reyes looked around at his men, at the enforcers surrounding them, at the crowd of inmates who were very carefully not taking sides. Mason could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the realization that he'd lost, that his play for power had failed spectacularly, that his only options now were surrender or suicide. This ain't over, Victor said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. You got the numbers today, but numbers change. People get tired of the old ways. Eventually, someone's going to take what you have. Maybe, Bulldog acknowledged. But not today, and not you. He gestured to his enforcers. Take their leadership to solitary. I'll work out the terms of their surrender with whoever's left in charge of their little organization. The rest of the Kings can go back to their cells and think about whether they want to follow leaders who got them into this mess. What happened next was swift and efficient. Victor and his top lieutenants were escorted away by Bulldog's men, heading toward the administrative building where guards, apparently on Bulldog's payroll, Mason realized, would ensure they spent the next few weeks in isolation. The remaining Kings dispersed into the crowd, their organization effectively decapitated, their challenge to Bulldog's authority thoroughly crushed. Mason watched it all unfold with a mixture of relief and unease. The violence he'd feared hadn't materialized. Bulldog had won through intelligence, strategy, and preparation rather than bloodshed. But he'd also witnessed something else. The true extent of Bulldog's power, the depth of his network, the ruthlessness with which he maintained control. This was what compassion looked like in Blackwater, protected by an iron fist, sustained by an underground empire, defended through manipulation and strategic deception. After the yard cleared and inmates returned to their afternoon routines, Bulldog found Mason in the storage room, sitting alone among the ledgers that had helped make this victory possible. You did good work, Bulldog said, sitting down across from him. The financial analysis, spotting the pattern with Dante, that was crucial. We couldn't have pulled this off without it. I didn't do it for this, Mason said quietly. I didn't want to be part of a gang war. I just wanted to help Eddie, to do one good thing in a bad place. I know, Bulldog's voice was surprisingly gentle. And that's exactly why I trusted you. You're not in this for power or profit. You're in this because you genuinely care about people, even people you don't know, even people who can't do anything for you in return. That's rare, Mason. That's precious. And in a twisted way, that's exactly what made you so valuable to me. What happens now? Mason asked. The Kings are finished? For now. Their leadership will be in solitary for months. By the time they get out, their organization will have fractured, their members absorbed into other groups or gone independent. They won't be a threat again for years, if ever. Bulldog paused. But there will always be someone else. That's the nature of this place. Power creates challengers. Order creates chaos trying to tear it down. The best we can do is maintain the balance, keep things stable enough that people can survive. And Eddie? What about him? Eddie Crawford is protected for life. My word on that. Permanent and unconditional. What he did, bringing us the intelligence about the King's real plan that saved everything. He's earned more than protection. He's earned respect. Bulldog smiled slightly. That old man's got more steel in him than half the young punks in this place. He just needed someone to remind him it was there. That evening, Mason sat with Eddie in the library. The two of them surrounded by books, neither was reading. The old man looked peaceful, more at ease than Mason had ever seen him. I heard what you did, Mason said, telling Bulldog about the King's real plan. That was brave. Brave? Eddie chuckled softly. I'm an old man with nothing to lose. Bravery is what you did, giving up everything you had for someone you didn't even know. That's the kind of courage that actually matters. I didn't know it would lead to all this. The job with Bulldog, the confrontation with the Kings, any of it. I just saw someone suffering and couldn't look away. That's how it always starts, Eddie said thoughtfully. The biggest changes in history, the most profound transformations, they all begin with someone refusing to look away from suffering. You didn't plan to change this place, Mason, but you did. You reminded people that compassion is possible, even in the darkest circumstances. You gave an old man his dignity back. You showed a crime boss that there's still goodness in the world worth protecting. He reached over and patted Mason's hand with his trembling fingers. Never underestimate the power of a small act of kindness. You never know what it might become. That night, Mason lay on his bunk reflecting on everything that had happened since he'd walked through Blackwater's gates 2 months ago. He'd come in as a terrified kid who'd made a stupid mistake. He'd expected to spend his years here just trying to survive, keeping his head down, counting the days until release. Instead, he'd become something else. A catalyst. A symbol. Someone who'd changed the dynamics of an entire prison through the simple act of caring about another human being. He'd found purpose in the ledgers, meaning in the work, connection in the most unlikely relationships. He'd witnessed the best and worst of human nature, seen how power corrupted and how compassion persisted even in the bleakest environments. He still had 7 years and 10 months left on his sentence. 7 years and 10 months of navigating this complex world he'd accidentally transformed. There would be more challenges ahead, more tests of his principles and his courage. The Northside Kings were defeated for now, but Bulldog had been right. There would always be someone else, some new threat to the fragile order they maintained. But Mason wasn't afraid anymore, not like he'd been that first day. He understood now that survival in Blackwater wasn't just about avoiding violence or accumulating power. It was about holding on to who you were, refusing to let this place turn you into something less than human. His mother had been right all along. You could lose yourself one small compromise at a time, or you could fight to maintain your humanity through small acts of courage and compassion. Mason had chosen the second path, and it had led him somewhere he never expected. He thought about the $10 he'd given away, that tiny sum that had seemed so insignificant but had changed everything. It had bought protection for Eddie Crawford. It had caught Bulldog's attention. It had set in motion a chain of events that had reshaped the entire power structure of Blackwater Correctional Facility. $10, the price of a few candy bars on the outside, the cost of a small gesture of humanity in a place designed to strip humanity away. It had been worth every penny. Mason closed his eyes and for the first time since arriving at Blackwater, slept peacefully through the night.